Welcome to Rook Quality Systems webinar series with today's webinar titled Compliant Agile Development for Software as Medical Devices and Connected Devices. I am Jaclyn Maney, Marketing Manager at Rook Quality Systems. And on behalf of Rook and today's presenters, Ryan Kruchten and Weronika Michaluk, thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to touch on a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the full on-demand webinar recording will be shared with you all. In addition, we will provide a few follow-up webinar resources, including a recap of today's Q&A session, a webinar summary with on-demand chapters, and the presentation slide deck. You can expect to have all of these resources within your email inbox within the next 24 hours. In addition, we encourage you to ask any questions that may arise during today's webinar using the Q&A chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen, labeled Q&A. The webinar will conclude with a Q&A session where Ryan and Weronika will address your questions live. Today's webinar is going to start off with covering key challenges that software as a medical device developers face. And then we're going to dive into what is an SaMD, followed by discussing agile development versus waterfall development and how to choose the best approach for you. And then we're going to discuss software design and development documentation and what the FDA expects that to look like, followed by AI and machine learning, regulatory considerations, and cybersecurity and software development. And then we will end with a Q&A session.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan Kruchten. My background is in biomedical engineering from the University of Minnesota, with professional experience in R&D, manufacturing, quality, and regulatory, primarily supporting Class 2 medical devices. At Rook QS, we support companies of all sizes, from one-person startups to Fortune 500s. Our team is full of bright engineers and certified auditors. We help our clients win with quality and achieve regulatory compliance, including software development.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Very nice to meet you. My name is Weronika. I am a medtech practice lead at HTD Health, biomedical engineer by training, have been in medical device space for more than a decade right now. Started as a biomedical engineer doing, like all this fun stuff, soldering and coding. Also worked in South Korea as a neuroscientist, focused on the optogenetics research. And after that time, I moved to Miami, where I did my master's and MBA, worked for a big medical device organization, Boston Scientific, where I was in charge of also digital health and software as medical device projects. And since 4 years, I have been leading medtech practice at HTD Health. And at HTD Health, we are on a mission to imagine, as you can see, design and build a more human-centric, accessible and productive healthcare industry. We are a team of 200 people right now in 3 continents with offices in Poland, Argentina, and US, and we are purely focused on healthcare space. We support organizations from startups all the way to big organizations throughout the whole product lifecycle, from product ideation through product discovery, design, and all the way to successful product market launch. So I mentioned SaMD, right? So before we actually dive into our main topic, agile development, I want the whole audience to be on the same page. So let's start with the basics. What is actually SaMD, which is software as a medical device? Over here, you can see the formal sentence that says software intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device itself. What does it mean? It means that this software as medical device is any software that can be run on your smartwatch, on your phone, doesn't require any hardware medical device itself, but actually is a medical device because it functions as it is. So now let's give you some examples. Everybody for sure have been in a hospital, right? You've seen this big medical devices. And all these medical devices need software to run, and which we call software in a medical device. You have here some examples like EKG, insulin pump, and USG machines. And then to compare software as a medical device, you have here mobile EKG, you have here automated insulin dosing system, or mobile USG. And the purpose is the same. We do the same things, but with software as a medical device, we can perform all these examinations, the diagnosis at home, thanks to which we give patients more access to healthcare, to care, which is great. Like I'm having here the Apple Watch, right? It's not advertisement, but it's a class 2 medical device. And because it can do EKG. So I can do EKG at home and then send the data to physician or just check it out whether I'm okay. So we covered the basics, but now to actually develop this software as a medical device, throughout the development, for sure, there are some challenges. And in my experience, working with many clients, I would like to share with you some key challenges that I have seen. But also I would like to ask you, our audience, what are the challenges that you have faced so far? And then we'll check whether the challenges are similar or the same. So the very first one is, I would say one of the biggest headaches is dealing with regulations for medical software. The rules for medical software keep changing all the time. And that's especially true, for like AI or cybersecurity requirements. Because the FDA very recently released new guidance for AI, for cybersecurity, and it's great because FDA keeps up to date with all of the new technologies and just want to ensure that we have regulations to follow. But we and you as well as manufacturers, we all have to keep up to, which is not so easy. And making it even more like rules in Europe under the medical device regulations are different from FDA requirements. So it's very important to have the team that is experienced and keeps up with all of the changes. So the second challenge that I would say that I've seen the most is also development speed and compliance. And that links very well to our topic today, which is compliant agile, right? So of course, everybody wants to go to market as soon as possible. But if we then forget about compliance, we might face some difficulties along the way, or even worse, like recall once we are already in the market. Nobody wants that. So we have to keep in mind both compliance, but also our budget, right? So we'll cover compliant agile in a second, in a minute. So to actually how to mix speed and compliance at the same time. The next challenge would be cybersecurity and data privacy. And Ryan will share more details later on about it, but it's very important to really focus on cybersecurity and data privacy, because there's more and more threats, especially in the medical device space. And because we are in a field where we are actually saving patients' lives, we have to also keep their data safe and keep the devices very safe. But this is a challenge because, the technology is growing very fast and they are hackers all over. So also having a great team and knowledgeable team is important. The next challenge is interoperability and healthcare systems. So one thing is to design and develop a product, but if the product will just work by itself, will not be connected with healthcare systems, will not be connected with other devices, nobody will actually use it, or it will be hard for people to adopt it. It's very important to create a product with already interoperability in mind and to make it connected with other healthcare systems so that data will flow easily and smoothly. So that the devices will also be implemented very smoothly into like physicians, clinicians, or patients' workflows. So the products will not be like additional burden, but it will be, help for patients. Which also brings me to one more key challenge, which is patient engagement, usability, and market adoption. If we build a product, but nobody will use it, then, it's not the best for us, right? So it's very important also to involve patients early on, to get their feedback, to work together with them. With patients, if the product is for patients, but if you're designing like a device for physicians, clinicians, let's work with them early on as well to get their feedback early on. And I don't see the chat actually. I don't know if Ryan, you can see the chat or Jaclyn for questions, but I was just wondering if we got any challenges from the audience about their experience.
We did, Veronica. We got one challenge from Beth, and she said lifecycle management releases take too much time and resources.
Yeah,
And
fully agree. It's also linked to the development speed, right? And the compliance.
yes, for sure. And then another one from Nikki, and she said development speed and compliance, trying to utilize Jira and ADO versus paper docs for documenting everything.
Yeah, also, as well, development speed and compliance. Good. I mean, we're saying the same things,
Yeah.
which is, big challenge.
And then Bryce just said, agree with development speed and compliance and interoperability. Have seen both.
Glad to hear we are agreeing. I mean, not so glad, because these are
Yeah.
big challenges. But maybe we'll try to solve them at least somehow today.
Yes, that's all that's come in so far, but sounds like, yes, they're all aligned.
All aligned. So thank you so much, Jaclyn, for reading the comments. And actually, I would love to learn, Ryan, what do you think about these challenges? Have you seen similar ones?
Yeah, especially in the startup space. One key challenge I've seen clients face is the consequences of starting with quality too late in the process. One of the fundamental strengths of implementing a solid foundation of quality is it forces us to ask difficult questions at the outset of a project. So even though our answers to hard questions are not set in stone early on, it does force us to consider like how we want the end product to look and consider that in a structured and documented way. I found that typically when teams wait to document, they can also run into late in the game design changes because they've waited to consider those hard questions.
Yeah, fully agree. And great, great thoughts there as well. Thinking about compliance early on, it's very important. So, let's try to, Ryan, together share some tips and tricks and, information with our audience. So hopefully it will be easier for us to face these challenges and solve them in the future. So how to overcome these challenges? It's very important to have the strategic development approach from early on, as Ryan also mentioned, which we would say it's the path to success. Maybe not so easy and smooth always, but it's a path to success. So let's start by discussing, as Jaclyn mentioned before, waterfall versus agile development. And again, what is waterfall and what is agile development? Both are the development methods, and waterfall, you can think about the waterfall method as a water cascading, in a waterfall, like one after the other, right? So it's the same in the waterfall. You have one phase that you have to finish. Then after finishing one phase, you go to the next one and to the next one. So it's very sequential. And then on the other hand, agile is kind of, you can think about it like as a backpacking, let's say. So you're backpacking throughout Europe and you can adjust your route based on the weather conditions, based on how you feel, based on your budget. So it's the same with agile because you have some overall plan, let's say, but you can adjust it based on new regulations that are coming, based on new user feedback that you've been getting throughout the usability testing. So it just gives you more flexibility. But let's focus now a little bit more on the waterfall, because both waterfall and agile are very good development methods, but each of them have some pros and cons, and each of them could be applied to different projects. So as you can see over here, let's start with the good ones, with pros of waterfall. So the very first one is clarity and structure. So you have the linear nature of waterfall, and it ensures a very structured approach, right, to the project. And then it's documentation driven, because everything is given this phased approach. Waterfall really focuses and prioritizes documentation. It's predictable because you start with like very detailed plan, and then you know what is gonna happen. And it minimizes scope creep because you agree on the scope and you just stick to it. But then on the other hand, what are some cons? There's no big flexibility. It's because if you agree on the scope, you just follow that. So it's hard to change. Delayed testing, because you normally just build the complete device and then you test at the end. Less customer feedback, which is also linked to testing, because you want to get the customer feedback at the end once you finish the product, and could also lead to a longer time to market given the sequential nature. And then on the other hand, we have agile. And let's start with the agile. Like agile is guided by these 4 key principles from Agile Manifesto. First, agile values individuals and interactions over processes and tools, meaning we prioritize collaboration and communication between team members. Second, it emphasizes working software over comprehensive documentation and focusing on delivering functional products rather than just paperwork. And third, Agile promotes customer and user collaboration over contract negotiation, involving clients and customers and patients throughout the development to ensure we meet their needs. And finally, Agile embraces responding to change, as we mentioned before, over following a plan. Of course, plans are also important, and I will share that in a second. Allowing teams to adapt quickly when requirements shift or new information emerges. And okay, so now let's give you some like visual diagram on how agile process work, how we do it at HTD and also at Rooks for sure. So we start with the product vision. We gather all the requirements from our clients, from users, from physicians or patients, and we create this prioritized product backlog. We normally work at HTD in 2 weeks sprint iterations. You can also do 4, but 2, I would say, it's the average and the most common. We start this iteration, which is this 2 weeks sprint by sprint planning. So we plan our work based on this prioritized product backlog. And then after that, we work on these increments, right? So at the end of these 2 week sprints, we would have an increment of work that would show during the sprint review. And you would normally show that also sprint review would be also called in SaMD space design review, because we would also have an independent reviewer here and our clients and any other stakeholders to review the work, provide feedback, and make any changes if needed. And then you would have sprint retrospective to improve the work as well if needed. And then we have the deployment. We normally, the deployment is like at the end, but it's here to just show you the visual way graph of how we work. So we start with the vision, then we prioritize the work. We work with the increments, 2 weeks increments. We can make any changes, and then we also, what is very important, during these sprints, the development team works on the device, on the product itself, but then there is also the quality team, Ryan's team, that works at the same time on the documentation, which is also very important to highlight, that we must work on the product design, development, and the quality go hand in hand. Not to forget about it, and start the documents like at the end. So now, you might be thinking, okay, Weronika, you said like Waterfall focuses on documentation and Agile focuses on like teamwork, collaboration over documentation, and medical device, everything must be documented. In the quality, we say what's not documented doesn't exist, right? So I didn't say that Agile says that there is no documentation. There is. And it's very important to actually start documentation early on when we work in the agile way as well. And in a second, I will share with you over here the diagram that is an agile process that is compliant with IEC 62304. And IEC 62304 is the standard for the software development lifecycle. And when we work on the software as medical device, we follow this standard. And here I will share with you a diagram, the guidance, the AMI TIR 45 guidance on the use of agile principle practices in the development of medical device software. On the left-hand side over here, you can see different points in this standard that talk about development planning, requirements analysis, architecture design, detailed design, unit implementation, integration testing, system testing, and release. So now let's start with okay, so how do we actually work? So for each product, as I mentioned before, we always start with the product vision. And we start with this project planning. So what does it mean? So we plan high level. How long will this project take? What are the resources needed? What are the team members, right? Who is gonna work on that? Then we gather these requirements, we analyze them, we create first preliminary risk analysis as well. We create high-level backlog for the product. And then based on these requirements that we gathered, we create architecture design, we create infrastructure design. That is all the base for the product to work then on for specific releases. In Agile, we have different releases that then create specific, product. So for each release, we also plan. We create specific plan. So there is the documentation. Then we also have to implement specific integration, testing, system testing, that is, for specific release of the product. And then each release consists of multiple iterations. Iterations are these 2-week sprints that we follow in Agile methodology. And for each iteration, as you've seen in the diagram before, we have these 2 weeks sprints, right? So we have to plan for each sprint. So we also create documentation for each sprint. We also have to test each and every story, user story that we write for each sprint. So we have to also create verification plan, protocol, and then we create the verification testing result. And then, as I mentioned, the stories. So the stories are like small items in Jira that one of our members in the audience mentioned, that they use Jira as well. So we write requirements, user stories for each sprint. So it's also kind of part of the documentation, right? Because for each story, we also have to create different requirements. We have to also then implement that, link that to architecture design, and then detailed design comes from that as well. So as you can see over here, we can mix Agile together with the standard. And if you have not yet, I would really recommend and encourage you to read this AMI TIR 45 guidance on the use of Agile practices in the development of medical device software, because it can really help you understand how you can combine, these two different worlds, Agile, flexibility with documentation and standards. So, that's what we do, but I would love to hear from you, Ryan. What do you think is like the most important when developing software, when developing devices from compliant way, because you're an expert in here as well?
Yeah, I think the most important from a quality perspective is having our eyes wide open to the task at hand of developing a medical device. Because a lot of development teams have tons of software experience, but when it's software as a medical device, there's that extra layer of documentation as you've just described here. So software development is something that a talented team can do very quickly, but the team must also recognize that like the level of documentation we have to compile to support a medical device regulatory submission is very high. So let's get into what the documentation might look like. And I will request control here. Um, and just what other things the development team needs to have on their radar as they go through these iterations. All right, so for software development approaches and tools, your methodology matters just as much as your coding tools. Whether you're using tools like Jira or Git, the key is how they support traceability and collaboration along with compliance. Traceability is a critical concept for understanding how all of our user stories or user needs, software requirements, detailed design specifications, test cases, and test reports all come together to tell the story of compliant development. And that was beautifully illustrated in Veronika's last slide. Now, the first question is, how do we choose the right method between Agile and Waterfall? And like any good consultant would say, the answer is it depends. The truth is that it's not always binary. Waterfall tends to work well when requirements are fixed. So things like supporting software in a device, such as an embedded firmware with minimal user interaction. Agile, on the other hand, supports iterative development and is ideal when requirements evolve, such as with mobile apps or AI-driven diagnostics. Oftentimes at Rook, we work with clients who have a functioning software product without supporting documentation. And if you're late to the documentation game, we've seen waterfall approaches work great for getting caught up and then shifting to Agile for maintenance of the design history file or DHF. And this is just one example of how waterfall and Agile aren't always mutually exclusive in the life cycle of medical device software development. So when selecting the best development method, you should consider the classification of the device, risk level, user interaction, and how often software updates are anticipated. So for example, with AI and ML-based software, algorithms may be expected to evolve or continuously learn as new training data becomes available. And that's when Agile becomes necessary, not just beneficial, because you kind of need the flexibility to refine models and address data-driven outcomes and updates. But regardless of methodology, alignment with design controls under 21 CFR Part 820.30 is essential. And this means your chosen approach must support traceability between the user needs, design inputs, and validation activities. Any software-related discussion today is kind of incomplete without considering how artificial intelligence and machine learning play in and might be a factor. So let's talk about how the FDA thinks about these things. AI and ML introduce unique challenges, and models learn and adapt, which doesn't fit neatly into the traditional validation paradigms that we experience with other medical device projects. It means that our medical device could constantly be changing throughout its life cycle post-market, which is very unique. And that's where the predetermined change control plan comes in. So the FDA's proposed PCCP framework allows manufacturers to define how a model may change post-approval without requiring a new submission. And this is really important because it's a process similar to a letter to file, but on the front end of the change instead of as changes are rolled out. So you pre-specify what types of changes are allowed, the methods for implementation, and how you'll verify safety and effectiveness. And this supports continuous learning while ensuring that boundaries are clearly drawn. It's a proactive way to future-proof AI products, reduce your regulatory burden down the road, and increase transparency with the FDA so they feel comfortable with what's going on and what changes are being made. The key is that the FDA gets the chance to review this PCCP prior to market clearance or approval. And that's evidenced by the PCCP having its own field in the E-Star template for 510K submission. So similar to AI and ML, it's hard to talk about software without considering cybersecurity. And the good machine learning practices guidance starts to get into some of those questions. This was a collaboration between the FDA, Health Canada, and the UK's MHRA. It emphasizes 10 guiding principles for trustworthy machine learning-based medical devices and starts the conversation on integrating cybersecurity risk management into the development process. Among the most impactful guiding principles, I'll highlight two of them, are the Secure Product Development Framework and Risk Management. And the Secure Product Development Framework, or SPDF, ensures transparency in your development process and traceability across outputs. It prioritizes security considerations throughout the development lifecycle as new changes are made and rolled out to existing devices. And then risk management is especially crucial for AI and ML because of model drift, data poisoning, and other unique risks that aren't necessarily posed to other device types. Risk management must be holistic, covering model training, validation, deployment, and even user interactions. And this aligns with ISO 14971 and FDA's pre-market cybersecurity guidance. So as is true in other device development domains, risk management should be a never-ending process as new risks may be identified, and the probability of occurrence or exploitability should be updated once we're on market when data can support those numbers. Let's talk a little about training data and how we validate that. Training data is the backbone of any artificial intelligence performance. And if it's corrupted, biased, or unrepresentative, your model is inherently flawed in some way. And that's why the FDA places so much emphasis on this. So they talk about data integrity and security, the importance of using a secure data pipeline to prevent unauthorized manipulation, and verification and validation of data sets before and after training. The FDA is especially concerned with data lineage. You need to know where your data came from, how it's labeled or indexed, and whether it's been altered. So Reddit is not a good source for AI or ML medical device data, of course. This ensures your model behaves reliably under real-world conditions, and these training data guidelines should be integrated into and referenced in the risk management process. That means we should consider the possibility as we map our risk management process that bad data might be introduced when a model is being trained or if it performs continuous learning. And then we can reference the integrity and security mechanisms that we put in place to serve as a risk control. So as following the secure product development framework would suggest, cybersecurity can't really be bolted on at the end. It must be embedded throughout development. Cybersecurity is important for all devices, but particularly for those that are network connected or present the possibility of multi-patient harm. The E-Star template also has a checkbox selecting if your device considers risks that could pose multi-patient harm. Cybersecurity is a relatively new consideration for many development teams, and it will continue to evolve as the digital landscape around us changes. So like other aspects of device design, the FDA expects a risk-based approach starting at the planning phase. And this includes a cybersecurity plan along with your software development plan. In the design phase, it typically includes threat modeling, security controls, and initial risk management activities. And if you're performing an agile method, this could look like performing each of those deliverables in a much more abbreviated fashion per sprint. This is about more than compliance. It's about protecting patients from harm due to software breaches, ransomware attacks, or other malicious tampering of connected medical devices. And I think that's just really important to highlight because as we develop software, it's easy to just kind of get caught in the technical pieces of it, but it's really, really important to just continue to consider that this is a medical device at the end of the day, and there is risk of patient harm. Cybersecurity controls extend to physical device connections as well. So think like a USB or an Ethernet port that's exposed or possibly accessible. The entire attack surface of the device must be considered by the manufacturer during threat modeling and while considering which cybersecurity controls to implement. So some best practices, basically any breach that could be exploited can directly impact patient health. And so the FDA is not treating cybersecurity as optional or something to layer on after development. It must be a core part of your risk management strategy from day one. And that also helps as the manufacturer us save time and money, because if we're considering these things from the outset, it means we don't necessarily have to remold a plastic component in the case of software in a medical device to lock down an exposed port, as an example. So this starts with a risk-based approach, just like everything else. We need to look at cybersecurity, not just through the lens of potential attack vectors, but also through clinical impact. So what could happen if a vulnerability is exploited? And this question is key for understanding in our cybersecurity risk assessment, how risks translate to clinical impact, not just technical inconveniences. So could it lead to something like a delayed therapy, a loss of function, or maybe an incorrect dosing or device output? Those questions have to be answered early, and the mitigations should be built into your design rather than patched in later, if you care about saving time and money in development. And it's not a one and done activity. So just like other aspects of risk assessment, cybersecurity risk assessment has to continue across the life cycle of the product, especially after it's on the market. Post-market, it's critically important to continue monitoring known vulnerabilities in particular. So your pre-market risk management activities and some submissions will require performing a vulnerability assessment of all software components, think commercial off-the-shelf, third-party software of unknown provenance. The known vulnerability assessment should include a sufficiently robust search, using resources that FDA recommends at least looking at the CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. For each vulnerability, we need to describe how it was discovered and perform a safety and security risk assessment, covering how that may impact the medical device and ultimately contribute to the risk of patient harm. Details of any safety and security risk controls that were needed to address the vulnerability should be described, including any compensating controls. A major tool for managing and understanding cybersecurity implications is threat modeling, which I briefly described earlier. And this is where your team sits down and asks questions like, how might someone try to gain unauthorized access to the system? What are the entry points? And what data flows are exposed? It's about identifying your attack surface and understanding how adversaries might behave. And that insight directly feeds into your security controls and helps prioritize and triage where to invest effort, because as we all know, time and money is not an infinite resource. And from there, documentation becomes critical. And that's where the SBOM or software bill of materials comes in. So the FDA requires an SBOM that lists all of those third-party or commercial off-the-shelf software components, along with their versions, where they came from, whether they're still supported, and their end of support date. And now, why do they require that? Because when a new vulnerability like Log4 Shell, which was a few years ago, but a huge vulnerability that hit industry, we need to instantly know whether our medical devices in the field are affected, and therefore if patient safety is being compromised. And that's what the SBOM gives you, which is visibility and speed. The FDA suggests creating machine-readable formats like FPDX or CycloneDX, and those allow us to parse and act upon any vulnerabilities quickly. It makes it easier to set up an automated SBOM analysis on a regular basis, such as daily or weekly, depending on the device risk. And then we should also consider the ease of rolling out updates to fielded devices. And that's where kind of network connectivity, it might feel like that's always increasing risk, but it can also be a risk mitigation in the sense of rolling out updates in a much quicker way. Security doesn't only need to be considered at the component level. It extends to your system architecture and must be considered within the context of the larger system in which the device operates. So as an example for a software as a medical device, if that application is downloaded onto an iPad or some other type of tablet, that's part of that system that we need to consider. You need to design the system with protection in mind. So this is considering encryption for data in transit and at rest, proper access controls to limit who can do what, and monitoring mechanisms to detect and respond to suspicious activity. It's not enough to know what data you're protecting to, say, comply with HIPAA, but you also have to know how it moves, where it's stored, and how it's accessed. Defense in depth is a common strategy which layers security controls and is employed to enhance devices' security posture. Testing is the final check, pre-market, before release, and post-market for updates. Security use case testing, including penetration testing, helps to validate that our defenses were effective. But it's not just about finding a third party to test your product, put them in a room with the product and say, all right, guys, test it, and then tell us when you're done and we'll write the check. We have to internally document those findings and show how they tie into the risk management strategy and process in our organization's words. So this is an assessment of outcomes, and it's critical for penetration testing, and it can include new design documentation, especially when remediations are required. So in my experience, you should plan on having penetration testing performed at least twice. And I know it's expensive, but it's really difficult, especially with more complex devices, to foresee what vulnerabilities might be discovered, especially for connected or complex or other like software as a medical device product. So the first test should be viewed as an opportunity to uncover those vulnerabilities and improve the device security profile. And then we have time as the development team and the quality team to implement and document remediations based on the results. And then finally, we would have the penetration test rerun to verify effectiveness. When the penetration testing reveals an exploitable flaw and you choose not to remediate it right away, that decision must be justified and documented for the FDA for all known vulnerabilities. And this is about transparency, traceability, and then also covering our acceptable residual risk levels. It's not necessarily perfection. I've never seen a penetration test report that said the device was perfectly secure and has no risk. For devices that pose a risk of multi-patient harm, though, deferring remediation is typically not a great strategy because it's really difficult to justify why any medium or severe risk is okay to push off and defer. The final pre-market cybersecurity consideration I'll cover is labeling. And the FDA has lots of questions about cybersecurity labeling. So the intent is that we need to communicate the security profile of the device to customers so that they can safely and effectively use the product. The list of labeling considerations is long, like I said, but I'll just mention some big ones. And these include device instructions and specifications related to the cybersecurity controls that are required for safe and effective use. So this would be like password requirements, use of a firewall, those types of things. A list of network ports and other interfaces, and their approved destination endpoints. So if you have an exposed USB port, what are the approved endpoints, or what are the list of devices we want you to use that USB port with? Any supporting infrastructure requirements. So this might be like a security layer in a Wi-Fi connection. Making the SBOM available. Some people elect to list it in the user manual or instructions for use. Other people just say contact the manufacturer, and that's a risk-based decision. And a description of critical device functionality like backups, restoring, and logging. So in the event of a breach or something like that, we need to have forensic logs that we, as the manufacturer, can go back to and basically have the breadcrumbs of what happened, why, and by who. Once the product is on the market, the work continues, of course. So this is where we have a cybersecurity management plan that defines how post-market patches and updates will be handled, including timelines for rollouts based on risk. This plan should also include a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy. And this is something the FDA strongly encourages, which everyone in the industry knows that means it's the requirement. The idea is to welcome external researchers to report issues and then have a process in place for evaluating and addressing those reports. It creates a feedback loop that ultimately strengthens the safety of your product and the cybersecurity posture. So now let's switch gears a little bit and discuss how we ensure that we have FDA-compliant software documentation throughout the development process. So in 2023, FDA updated its guidance on content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. And the message was clear: documentation expectations depend on risk, just like everything else. So if your device performs low-risk software functions, like a minor calculator tool embedded in a broader system, you'll likely fall under the basic level documentation. But if your software is integral to device performance, especially network connected or autonomous in any way, or AI or ML enabled, that's when we have the enhanced level of documentation. So the enhanced level includes several detailed deliverables: your software architecture diagram, software requirement specification, unresolved anomaly list, if there are any, just to name a few. And then in many cases, a risk assessment of those unresolved anomalies. And whether your device submission requires basic or enhanced documentation level for the guidance, it's important to understand you must still comply with IEC 62304. So for basic documentation level device, this means that you may not be submitting all of these documents to FDA for their review. However, internally, as a team, we still have to go through those processes and generate those deliverables. When generating documentation to support a regulatory submission, something that I typically find helpful is to treat each required deliverable as its own focused document. So instead of one giant design history file document describing a bunch of plans, here's our software development plan, our cybersecurity plan, our risk management plan, just have one document for each of those things. And so it's a modular set of files covering architecture, risk analysis, verification summaries, everything listed in that enhanced level documentation package. This is really helpful because it makes the product and documentation updates easier, and it helps your internal review process stay organized. In the eStar template, each of the listed deliverables has its own line item, and you can't in an eStar upload the same document twice. It flags it and says this document has already been uploaded, upload a different one. So this is also a way to kind of save you a few minutes on the back end of like, okay, I have to split this out into separate documents now. And when you're incorporating external test reports, such as a penetration test from a third-party vendor, as an example, it's best practice to include an internal cover page summarizing the key findings, similar to what you would do for a 60601 test report, and how they relate to your risk assessment, and how they tie into design controls and verification plans and reports. So don't just attach the raw report and hope for the best, because FDA will say, okay, this is great, but how does it apply? Provide the context for the FDA reviewers to understand the impact and applicable findings to the device in your organization's words. Also, visuals are your friend. Everyone appreciates a clear diagram. So if you're documenting your software architecture, include visuals that show how components interact, how data flows, and how it all ties back to your requirements. The FDA software guidance has a really nice example of how they recommend showing how all of the software units connect together in the broader system, and then what unit test cases are covered, as well as how they tie to requirements and specification IDs. And then make sure you include a traceability matrix to show how each requirement maps to the design elements. And lastly, here's a tip that's easy to implement and can make a big difference. Cross-reference FDA guidance documents directly in your approval workflows, which sounds like a lot of work, but I promise it's worth it. So if a document aligns with a specific section of a guidance, cite it. This shows the FDA reviewers that we understand as a company their expectations, and we've designed our processes accordingly. In many ways, the software documentation is a place where the FDA guidances are extremely prescriptive, and that actually works in our favor. Because when we follow the roadmap, it becomes easier to justify our design and reduce review cycles. It also helps to build in some credibility with FDA, kind of proving, look, we read your guidance and we took it to heart and we implemented exactly what you recommended. And so it helps kind of close the gap of becoming a trustworthy and vendor or company to the FDA. So to wrap up, the convergence of agile development, AI and ML technologies, and rising cybersecurity threats is reshaping how we must build and regulate medical devices. And the FDA's evolving guidance it seems like yearly at this point, really reflects that. And so by aligning with the frameworks that they're putting out, we're not only reducing regulatory friction, but we're also hopefully saving time and money in the long run. And ultimately, the biggest thing is patient safety.
Fully agree with you, Ryan. Thank you so much. And you actually discussed, you really covered so much, and it's great that you recorded this session because there was lots of very good information. And I can see over here a couple of questions, from our audience. So let me, I can see here. In your experience, how have you managed risk within agile methodologies? Do you conduct a risk analysis for each user story in every sprint? If so, how do you integrate clinical knowledge into a risk assessment process? Additionally, how are subject matter experts involved? So, thank you, Mariano, for the question. It's a very important question, and also what Ryan mentioned during the presentation. It's very important to start risk analysis early on, not to wait, and to actually do it throughout the whole product development, because we start with a preliminary risk analysis when we have actually the team of developers, quality lead, quality engineers. We also bring on subject matter experts because it's very important to have different point of views to then discuss these different risks. And there could be, internal risks, that could be like external risks. Let's say if you develop some software that is connected to some device, there could be a risk of just disconnecting, right? Let's say there is a software that runs in OR and it's connected in a device that is in OR, and the device, something happens, there is no internet connection. So then how do we mitigate that risk? Or then the other thing could be, okay, patient has the software and they click on the wrong button. What if? So how do we mitigate that? And then there are some other clinical parts, right? So what we do normally, we bring on different subject matter experts and we involve them early on as much as possible. And we run risk analysis, even even before starting any sprint, and then doing it throughout the whole product lifecycle. I don't know, Ryan, if you have any other experience or you would agree with me.
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well. One thing I prefer to do with Agile is just have a overarching like software product level, like an FMEA or similar for like the nuts and bolts of the risk documentation. And then that document will get revved a lot, but it's really nice to have a comprehensive risk analysis all in one place. I think it's really helpful, especially when you're going through and reviewing that document, to not have to jump between where things are and where things live, and kind of lose train of thought. It's much easier, in my opinion, to have it all in one place so that you can really consider the full device risk. And then as sprints are completed and gone through, update accordingly.
Would fully agree with you. Thank you. So I see another question here from Hansi. When regulatory authority, FDA, EU, and we talk about performance validation, is this the same with the validation process that in software development lifecycle? If not, what's the difference? So I would say that performance validation in regulatory context differs from the software validation in the development, because the regulatory performance validation focuses on proving the medical device performs as intended for its clinical purpose, like in real world, conditions with actual users. And then software validations in the development, it mainly confirms that the code and the product meets technical requirements and functions correctly, so that the product actually does what it's intended to do. So the key difference here is that regulatory performance validation requires clinical evidence and focuses on patient outcomes, while the software one is more technical and focuses more on the software functionality. So that's what I would say on this point. And I don't know, Ryan, if you would add anything or you'd also agree.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's the separation of clinical and like essential performance versus just like the software. It goes to this page next, it goes to this page next.
Yep. So I would read another one. We have some we got some questions, which is great. We have a good audience. So I see Gordon, somebody with experience of Agile SaMD suggested to me dedicated a number of sprints specifically to generating the necessary documentation. So I would say here, that yes, it's a good way as well to do so. You can have, how we work normally, we work like we have the development team, and at the same time we have a quality team that works hand in hand together, so that it's just streamline the work, and it helps to ensure that we are aligned, and we then just don't wait for like at the end for the documentation. But let's say if your resources are constrained and if you would rather focus first on the development and then would like to just focus on the documentation at the end, you can of course do so, but I would recommend at least having some documentation in the beginning, because like at the end it's hard to remember all of the decisions that you made, why have you made those, and you might just skip something. So it's possible, but it should be done, correctly and with some experienced team members, I would say. Ryan, I would ask you as well because you're an expert. How do you normally work?
I think that let's see. Sorry, I was trying to find the next question. But yeah, I think as you're going through the sprints, I would probably default to adding an additional like day or two to the sprint to cover the documentation, because you're right. Looking back on a sprint from several months ago, especially when you've continued with other sprints in the meantime, a lot of the nitty-gritty and important detail can get lost.
Exactly. Yes. Is there any question, Ryan, that you see we should cover, because we have 2 minutes left, so we discussed many of them. And of course,
Um,
also share some, answers after. Go ahead, Ryan.
yeah, I just it's sort of related to the last one, but when implementing Agile for SaMD, Veronika, what strategies have you found most effective for integrating regulatory documentation requirements without disrupting sprints? Is it just that extra day of not being too disruptive, or are there other methodologies you found that work?
I would say that for us it really works best to have at least like, yes, like 1 or 2 days more um during the sprints, but also have a dedicated quality person, let's say like yourself, Ryan, that would work hand in hand with the development team, because sometimes we need these experts, like a quality expert, to also show or support the development experts how to create this documentation and what to exactly write. So I would say that definitely, how we work, it's like we create the documentation for, like, as I showed before, high level product, like the whole project, and then we narrowed this down to each sprint, because in my experience it's actually the best. But I wouldn't say that other teams would be able to work in a different ways. There are also some tools that you can implement that can streamline your work. Like, for example, if you work in Jira, Confluence, and other tools, you can then combine those together, and that will really help to streamline the documentation for the whole team. But it's also, we've been working with different clients in different ways. But again, I would just highlight that I would not wait with the documentation at the end, because as both of us we mentioned, we might forget something. And what's not documented in SaMD, in medical device space, doesn't exist. So let's keep in mind it's important. It's additional burden. I know not everybody likes documentation, but it's for the patient safety. And we should remember that patient safety is first priority. So I see here we are now out of time. So Jaclyn, it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Ryan. Seriously, you guys shared such valuable information that was also very easy to understand, which was great because it can be kind of hard to find easy to understand language on such a complex topic like this. So thank you both for your time, and thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us today and for the great questions.